I just wanted to say thank you all so much for joining. My name is Sarah Pierce, and I am the Housing and Energy Affordability Program Coordinator at the Metropolitan Housing Coalition. I oversee our EveryHome program, which seeks to include affordable housing and affordable utility conversations together. On the fourth Tuesday of each month, we host a webinar that is related to either affordable energy, affordable water, and how it connects to affordable housing. And today we have Rebecca Shelton from the Appalachian Citizens Law Center on the call to discuss findings from their recent report entitled Lights Out in Kentucky, Energy Burdens and Electricity Disconnections Across the State. We will put the link to this report in the comments section so you all can have access to it. A little bit about Rebecca. She joined ACLC staff in July of 2019. And at ACLC, she analyzes policy and co-convenes federal campaigns related to issues of mine land reclamation, mine worker safety and health, climate and food resilience, and utility affordability to promote a more just and equitable future in Central Appalachia. She's a PhD in sustainability science from Arizona State University. Her dissertation was focused on understanding the politics of justice and energy transitions. She also has a Master's of Science in Plant and Soil Science from the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture and Food and Environment, and a Bachelor of Science in Earth and Environmental Science from Furman University. Thank you so much to Rebecca for speaking to us today about your report. We will have a Q&A session after the call, so be sure to put your questions in the chat. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Rebecca.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to go ahead and start screen sharing so I can put my presentation up. And I'm just going to dive right in. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to be presenting some of the findings from a report we recently released and co-authored with the Energy Equity Project and the Energy and Policy Institute. We looked at both energy and electricity burdens as well as electricity disconnections across the state, but particularly for utilities regulated by the Public Service Commission. Oops. So just quickly, the presentation format, I'm going to give a very brief context about rising residential energy rates in the state, and then some context about Kentucky's policy and regulatory landscape related to energy affordability and disconnections, briefly go over the data used in the report, and then jump into the findings on energy and electricity burdens, electricity disconnections, and customer assistance funding gaps. And I'll close out with conclusions and policy recommendations, and then we'll have time for question and answers. So just very briefly, some context here about what residential energy rates in Kentucky look like. The blue line, this graph on the side is the percent change in residential electricity rates, median household income, and the consumer price index over time. In 2024, the average residential retail price of electricity in Kentucky was about 13 cents per kilowatt hour. But that is a large increase from the last 20 years. Between 2001 and 2024, rates in the state increased by 128%. And so, we can see that Kentuckians are, of course, spending a higher portion of their income on electricity than they were 2 decades ago. Generally, rising energy rates have outpaced the consumer price index, so the pace of inflation, but a lot of that sort of disjuncture occurred along, a couple decades ago, and it's just never kind of come back together. So very briefly, Kentucky's kind of policy landscape. What does it look like? What are we talking about? Since we're going to talk about recommendations at the end, I wanted to give just an update or a high-level overview of what the landscape looks like. So utilities regulated by the Public Service Commission must have any changes in their rate design, of course, approved by the Public Service Commission. Unfortunately, historically, the PSC has disallowed low-income rates, citing a couple of different statutes, and generally kind of stacking some arguments based on those statutes related to, one, saying that the current statutes do not allow Public Service Commission to consider low-income customers as a separate class of customers, saying that that would be discriminatory. And they also, in recent cases, have just simply said that the amount of evidence that interveners or even utilities themselves are able to show in support of a separate classification has been lacking and not sufficient for them to consider any kind of rate change reasonable. So unfortunately, there's been some barriers at the PSC for looking at equitable or low income rate design. There are some customer protections for disconnections. These are in the form of regulations promulgated by the Public Service Commission, but they're fairly limited, very limited, I would say. The requirements are concerning that, the utility has to provide 10 days notice before disconnection. Utilities in that notice have to tell customers about any available assistance programs. There are some protections that if a customer has entered into a partial payment plan, or if they have a medical certificate that's presented, or during the months of November through March, in the winter months, if a customer is able to present that they are a LIHEAP eligible with a certificate from the Kentucky Cabinet for Health and Family Services, then they will be given a 30-day extension, or they will not be disconnected as long as they're entering into some partial payment plan. So those are the protections available. They're not very strong, and they're very specific to certain populations. There are some utilities that have policies that go beyond the state established minimum protections. For example, Kentucky Power Company and LG&E and KU have some restrictions on when customers can be disconnected according to temperature extremes. So they can't be disconnected if the temperatures are 32 degrees or below, or 95 degrees or higher. Kentucky Power Company also has some restrictions on disconnections that require that disconnections must occur during business hours rather than after business hours, or on weekends or federal holidays. So there are some utilities that have gone beyond these minimums. And then in terms of customer assistance programs, again, there are some utility-specific customer assistance programs, but the only statewide program, as I'm sure folks on this call are familiar with, is LIHEAP. Over the last 3 years, unfortunately, LIHEAP funding for Kentucky has declined from $89 million to just about $60 million in fiscal year 25. And that at the household level, these are really minimal amounts. The maximum subsidy amount that a household can qualify for is $250, and the maximum crisis program amount that they can qualify for is $400. And then again, of course, there are eligibility constraints. Only households at or below 150% of the federal poverty level are eligible for LIHEAP. So that's a kind of a brief overview of the residential energy rates in Kentucky, as well as the policy landscape. This is just quickly, I want to share with you all the data that we used for this report. The data on energy bills comes from the Department of Energy's Low Income Energy Affordability, or LEAD tool. That tool was last updated in 2024. However, the update for the data was using billing and survey data from 2022. So I just want to share that as a caveat to say most of the kind of energy burdens calculated in here are going to be somewhat conservative, really, because as I showed in that first graph, energy rates have been increasing year over year. The disconnections data, it comes from the state, specifically the Public Service Commission. All regulated cooperatives and investor-owned utilities have to report residential disconnections due to non-payment each year to the Service Commission. Those reports contain monthly data on disconnections and reconnections for residents, as well as information about the average, minimum, and maximum arrears at disconnection. And then last, we requested and got LIHEAP distribution data from Kentucky's Cabinet for Health and Family Services. So now we'll jump into the results. Here is a figure of energy burdens across the state at the census tract level. Anything that you see in a green shade is under the 6% affordability threshold. So that's sort of a widely established and understood threshold that if your energy bills, if you're spending less than 6% of your household income on energy bills, they're considered affordable. If you're spending more than that, they're considered unaffordable. So anything that you see in like the orange and red tones are areas of the state where on average energy bills are unaffordable. So it's easy, and you can see very quickly from this image that a huge number of census tracts have average energy burdens that are over 6%. Kentucky's average energy burden itself is 5.8%. So it's just right there at that threshold. This is average. So, and it's a couple of years dated. So you can only sort of think about, where we're headed. And then I just want to point out, this is really small and it's hard to see on the map, but there are high energy burdens are particularly acute in the Louisville metropolitan area and in Eastern Kentucky. So those are the places in the state that we see some of the highest burdens popping up. So in addition to looking at this at the census tract, we also looked at energy and electricity burdens for each of the regulated utility, or for 28 utilities in the state, many of which are regulated by the PSC, some are also TVA. But you can see the blue bar the yellow line on this graph is 6%, the affordability threshold. The blue bar shows electricity burdens, and then we also looked at energy burdens. So this is other things that folks might be using gas or other types of energy in addition to electricity in their homes. And you can see again fairly quickly, energy burdens are unaffordable in service territories at over half of the electric utilities in our study. 61% of electric utilities have, on average, unaffordable energy burdens in their service territory. And you can also see that there's a really large disparity between companies. So there's average energy burdens in Duke Energy, for example, are as low as 3.9%. And then they go all the way up to 9.6% in Kentucky Power Service Territory, which is in the eastern portion of the state. We also separated out, looking at energy burdens for low income versus non-low income households. Again, defining low income as that at 150% of the federal poverty level. So you can see the sort of green dots on this figure are average energy burdens for non-low income households, and the orange are for low income hugholds. And again, it's really easy to see here that on average, for non-low income households, energy is affordable, but it is hugely unaffordable for low income households, having burdens ranging from around 14% to 22% for these households. We also looked at energy burdens for different kinds of housing types, and also looking at it for renters versus owners. We found that Kentucky renters face energy burdens that are 1.5 times of those of homeowners. So almost across the board, renters are disproportionately impacted by high energy burdens. The exception is really here in manufactured housing. No matter if you're renting or owning, mobile homes, residents face on average a 9.6% energy burden despite home ownership type. So that is of course problematic. We also looked at energy and electricity burdens for census tracts that were majority BIPOC residents versus majority white residents. There are a few different studies, research studies out there that have shown that even if you don't account for, not accounting for income level, there's still some kind of mechanism that is driving energy burdens up higher in neighborhoods and communities where the majority of residents are non-white. When we wanted to look at this in Kentucky as well, we found there were only 5 utilities that that served any census tracts that had the majority of residents as non-white, as BIPOC, people of color. And so you can see on this graph, the green bar are the average energy burdens for majority white census tracts, and the orange bars are the energy burdens for majority BIPOC census tracts. And you can see in 4 out of the 5 cases, the majority BIPOC census tracts face higher energy burdens than the majority white census tracts. This is especially true and problematic. There's the biggest disparity for Duke Energy service territory and for Louisville Gas and Electric Company. So those are the results I'll present on energy and electricity burdens, and I'll jump here now into the disconnections data. And we'll tie the two back together a little bit towards the end. We looked at disconnections for the last 3 fiscal years. In fiscal year 25, you can see there were nearly 270,000 disconnections, and there was a very alarming increase in disconnections. It was an 87% increase from the prior year. We don't see through the 3 years that the bars just trend up. And we kind of looked into this a little bit, as to why there may be a dip in fiscal year 24. And though we're not, we can't explain anything causally, we did notice that temperatures were a lot more moderate in fiscal year 24. So that could explain, some lower energy bills and potentially fewer disconnections there. But this fiscal year 25 increase kind of outpaces that. It seems to be unconnected to any kind of temperature extremes. We also I'm sorry, there's so many bars on this graph. We also looked at annual disconnections in total by utility across 23 different electricity utilities. You can see really clearly here on the right side of the graph that Kentucky Utilities and LG&E have the highest number of disconnections. They also serve the most households. They serve over 800,000 households, which makes up about 48% of the served households across all of these 23 utilities. But even then, they still account for a disproportionate number of disconnections. So they serve about 48% of the households, but they accounted for 77% of the total disconnections in fiscal year 2025. And you can see in fiscal year 2025, both of those utilities, they had a dramatic increase in disconnections that fiscal year. We also looked at disconnections across the year just to look at the seasonality. This is an aggregate for all of the utilities. Sort of as expected, we found that disconnections peak once in the spring. So following what you would imagine our people's, January and February utility bills from those hard winter months. And then they also peak again in late summer, early fall. So, those bills from the heat of July and August are building up there again and probably leading to some disconnections. And then the other thing I think just to point out is that, when temperatures are the coldest in the state in January, there were 13,000 13,000 households disconnected from electricity. And in the hottest summer months, there were 19,000 households disconnected. And so it points to the need for some protections during these extreme temperatures. The first graph I showed was the total number of households disconnected per utility. It's a little bit hard to compare across utilities because they have very different number of households that they serve. And so this one is it's a little bit more, it's more comparable across the utilities. It's the percent of disconnected households each month from the utilities. So you can see the lowest rate of monthly rate of disconnections actually occurred at Kentucky Power Company. 0.23% of customers were disconnected in any given month on average. And then the highest rates of disconnections occurred at Cumberland Valley Electric and also at Louisville Gas and Electric, where they're disconnecting about 2.4% of customers each month. What was interesting and somewhat unintuitive about our findings is we found that utilities that service territories with high electricity and energy burdens do not necessarily rank high in terms of percent of customers disconnected. So you'd sort of expect those things to trend together as bills are higher or as energy burdens are higher. There might be more disconnections, but we found that that wasn't always the case, kind of suggesting that there are policies and practices that companies can put into place to help prevent high energy burdens from resulting in disconnection. So just an example to pull out those sort of two extremes as a case study, Kentucky Power Company that has an average energy burden of 9.6%, but their monthly disconnection rate, as I said earlier, is 0.23%, versus LG&E, where their average energy burden across the service territory is 4.7%, but they have a 2.4% monthly disconnection rate. So LG&E's energy burden much lower, disconnection rate much higher. We also found that in Kentucky Power Company service territory, the disconnection rate has actually decreased across the 3 fiscal years that we looked at. And that was sort of surprising because there has been a rate increase that went into effect during that time period in 2024. Whereas in LG&E, the disconnection rate increased by 285% between the last 2 fiscal years, but there was not a rate increase during that time period. So Kentucky Power Company, we know that there were several utility level policies that were expanded in 2024 that I mentioned, some of them I mentioned earlier that could be playing a role in this. Again, they have sort of new time of day and day of week protections around disconnections so that they're not disconnecting customers outside of business hours. And they also have those temperature thresholds for disconnections, not disconnecting people when it's really hot or when it's really cold. And they did actually also increase their contributions to customer assistance programs that they have at the utility level. And they offer sort of generally between $115 and $175 of customer assistance in addition to what LIHEAP may provide. LG&E, they also do have temperature thresholds for disconnections. They do have a customer assistance program that offers quite a bit less than Kentucky Power Company's, around $70 a household. The two things that we noticed, we were trying to figure out what might be driving this increase in disconnections, and really the only two sort of shifts that we saw within the data that we looked at was that AMI, advanced metering infrastructure technology, was installed over the last couple of years in LG&E and KU's territory. This technology, they're able to disconnect people remotely, disconnect and reconnect remotely. We don't have any kind of data to suggest that AMI technology could be driving an increase in disconnections, but people have talked about this in the past as something that they were worried about with the technology. So it's definitely something to look into in future studies, the relationship between that technology and disconnections. And there is also a decrease in LIHEAP funding distributions in fiscal year 2025. So we also looked at the customer assistance funding gap. We looked at the amount of LIHEAP funding that is available and compared it to the total arrears that are accumulating for customers who face disconnection. So in this table, you can see the total kind of aggregate annual arrears for customers that face disconnection in each of the last 3 years. And then in the next column, you can see total LIHEAP spending. And so then, assuming that if you were able to cover the cost of these arrears that bring people to disconnection, as well as account for LIHEAP spending being part of also what helps prevent disconnections. In the last column, you see kind of the minimum customer assistance that we project would be required to prevent disconnections in these in the service territories of the electric utilities that we studied. And so the biggest takeaway right off the bat is that LIHEAP spending is hugely inadequate. In fiscal year 2025, it would accounted for only about a third of the need, a little less than a third. So I will continue to show a little bit more information about that in the next couple slides. To sort of further illuminate this customer assistance funding gap, we looked at the difference between what an affordable utility would be for a low income customer. So these are, again, 150% of the federal poverty level or below, and what they are currently paying. And so the green bar, this is for each of the utility service territories. The green bar is what an affordable utility bill would look like for these customers, and the red bar is what that all the way up to what their actual estimated utility bill is. So you remember from several slides ago, energy burdens range from around 13% to 22% for these customers across the service territories. And the gap between affordable bills and unaffordable bills ranges anywhere from $1,300 to $2,700 annually for these customers. So it's a really big gap. And if we assume that LIHEAP is distributed to every eligible household within these service territories, based on what we know was distributed in terms of LIHEAP dollars for each of these territories, distributions would average around $30 to $190 for each customer across these territories and meet just 1 to 9% of the home energy affordability gap. So LIHEAP, unfortunately, is just meeting a very, very small amount of the need. And that brings me to my conclusions. I'm sorry for the very texty slide. I think the big takeaways here, though, are just energy and electricity burdens are unaffordable for far too many Kentuckians and are particularly acute for families who rent, those living in manufactured housing and areas where the majority of residents are families of color, and also for low-income households. Disconnections increased an alarming amount between fiscal year and 24 and 25. LIHEAP is, though critical, just simply insufficient for ensuring that households are able to stay connected to electricity. And if historic trends continue, we can only expect that burdens and disconnections will continue to rise unless we put in place some protections and some policies to try and address these issues. And I think, we do see some data in our report suggesting that this is possible, that unexpected relationship between energy burden and disconnections. It might be that there are it suggests that there are utility level policies and practices that can help prevent or further exacerbate the likelihood of disconnection. And I think, just based on where we are in the state, there is a huge potential to be responsive. We can do a lot more. And so that's what we recommend at the end of the report, some policy recommendations. First, we would recommend that the PSC, we ensure that the PSC has the very clear statutory authority to address high energy burdens through equitable rate designs and arrearage management programs and other measures. We do think that the state should develop a customer assistance program to supplement LIHEAP. We'd love to see improved disconnection reporting requirements. I mean, some of the limitations on our data is that disconnections are reported at the scale of the utility service territory, which really, it makes it difficult to really discern which communities are most impacted. And so I think requiring that they report at the census tract or the zip code level would be extremely beneficial. We think that they should set a minimum floor for the level of debt that customers are allowed to accrue. I didn't show this graph in the slide, but there are places that are disconnecting customers that owe less than $30, less than $50. And so we think that we should set a floor there. Prevent disconnections during extreme temperatures and outside of business hours. And then last, we recommend that we expand weatherization programs, and specifically trying to target households with high energy burdens or those that live in single family rental units or manufactured housing, because we saw those housing types to experience the highest burdens. And that is the end of my presentation. So I will go ahead and wrap it up there and maybe, Sarah, I don't know how you want to moderate.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that presentation. That report has so much data in there that is so helpful to so many people who are working at the nonprofit level, community action level. So it provides the data needed to move some policies forward. It looks like we have a couple of comments and a question in here. Kathy mentioned that if Kentucky Power is electric only, so not including the cost of those using gas heat. I think that was in reference to the discrepancy between LG&E having a low energy burden, but the highest rates of disconnection.
Yeah, so for energy burden, we looked at both. We looked at the energy burden of customers in the service territory for that includes electric and also their gas and other kinds of sources of energy they may be using in their home. Um, so that would have been included in the comparison for both, if that makes sense. And I don't know if that's answering your question.
It looks like Byron also said that KPC has a higher rate of electric heating.
Yes, it does.
Mike asked, how do you calculate the minimum customer need to prevent disconnection? I believe that's in reference to the graph that had the red and the green.
Yeah. So that was basically just a calculation of what, to prevent disconnection. Yes. So actually, I think this is in reference. Is this in reference
It
to
is.
the
I was
table?
wrong. Yes.
Yeah.
To the table that was after that graph.
Yeah. So in the reports that the PSC requires, they require that the utilities report on the average arrears for all their disconnected customers. So you can do a little bit of backwards math and look at the total number of disconnections in that month and the average of their average arrears, and from that calculate a total figure for arrears in a given month. So we did that for each of the utilities and then added it up for each of the utilities annually and then added all of those together. So that is just that's just assuming that a customer would not be able to cover any of the bill that they needed, that caused them to be disconnected.
Yeah. And additionally, one of the questions that I had, so with the policies that you mentioned, it seems that we really need disconnection protections. And I know within the past few years, there have been some bills at the legislative level and some talks with the Public Service Commission to try to get these bills passed. I wanted to ask from your standpoint why you think those bills haven't moved forward, and could it be because of some misconceptions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question, and there are probably others that have been more involved in those legislative efforts that could answer them better. I mean, I think that some part of it is simply that they haven't had bipartisan leadership for the last couple sessions, which unfortunately in our current political landscape is just really needed for a bill to even get assigned to a committee. And I think that there are some misconnections. Some misconceptions. I also think that utilities and cooperatives do not want across the board policies, and they're powerful lobbyists. And but I think that the tides may be shifting a little bit on that. I think that energy affordability is reaching like such a crisis level that policymakers really are trying to grapple with what they could possibly do, because there's so much that they cannot do just based on the way that we've set up a system of regulated monopolies. So hopefully, I think that there's some misconception that, if we are preventing disconnections under certain conditions, that we're forgiving debt. And I think that is something that people don't love that idea. I could disagree with them in a number of cases, but I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. Byron.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca and Sarah, for putting this on. Fantastic report, Rebecca. I was privileged to be one of the early reviewers, and it continues to impress me. Um, Something just occurred to me during the course of your presentation regarding the gap in disconnections data between LG&E and Kentucky Power in particular that I don't believe we discussed before directly. And that relates to, and I'm wondering if you took this look, but so there's a gap based on race as to affordability and energy burden. Is there a gap as to who is disconnected the most? Kentucky Power Company tends to have a much wider rate base than, say, LG&E or Lexington, which makes up a big part of Kentucky Utilities rate base. And is it that Black folk are getting disconnected at a higher rate potentially? This is also partially in
Yeah.
response to some of Kathy's questions in the chat, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And unfortunately, the data is just so bad that we can't really make those kinds of do that kind of analysis rigorously. I mean, just because we only have disconnections for the entire service territory, so we can't break it down as much based on, census tract or zip code. And I think that's really part of the reason that we need this more granulated reporting on disconnections. Some of the studies that are out there that have shown this link between energy, unaffordable energy burdens disproportionately impacting neighborhoods and communities of color. They do have much better. It's like California has like good zip code level data, I think, on some of these things. So I think that's something, to be considered to add to disconnections legislation in the future is just let's get better reporting so we can get a clear understanding of where this is happening. So it's a super unsatisfying answer to your question, but I definitely think it's something we should learn more about.
It's the answer I expected, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Just be sure you don't mention in any proposed legislation that you're doing it to look at racism, because that'll get that legislation shot down real quick.
Yeah.
I think that also goes really well into Faith's question. Please explain, why do you feel energy burdens tend to be higher in BIPOC census tracts? And is it due to a higher concentration of substandard housing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't know the answer. We weren't able to do any kind of causal analysis on that. But Faith, there are a couple of papers that some different researchers have done, published in journals that I'd be happy to share with you. I think that the mechanism, though, is generally people are still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and I think that Kathy nails it here too, is that a lot of, white affluent neighborhoods, if we're talking specifically about Louisville, towards the East End, they have a higher average usage of electricity each month. And when we look at the West End, there may be a higher percentage of renters or more people in a certain area. And that can, of course, raise issues with the basic service charge. And I know something that Kathy used to mention is that and sorry, we have construction going on in the background. But when you have somebody in the West End, they're paying all of these basic service charges, especially if they're renting, that is actually paying for the upgrades that the East End is getting. And Kathy,
Yeah.
I hope I explained that correctly.
No, I mean, I think what you're saying is absolutely true. There is um, a mismatch between the energy usage versus how like fixed costs are spread across the customer base, I think is, and I will say too, though, I think, oh, yes, go ahead.
So it's several parts. When you have a daily fee, you're subsidizing or lowering the per kilowatt hour. So the higher users who are, this is all in testimony in rate cases. The higher users are white affluent neighborhoods, not low-income Black neighborhoods. Also, per mile, the density in lower income Black neighborhoods, how many daily fees they collect compared to how many in the mile of and that again, all of this is shown in testimony. So you get a lot of money in daily fees from our West End. They bring down the kilowatt hour, which is more highly used in white affluent neighborhoods. And they also subsidize the fact that in white affluent neighborhoods, good news, bad news, they have a lot of trees and they have a lot of outages, and we spend a lot of money there. Whereas in low income Black neighborhoods, the bad news, there's not. So the even that part of the service. So when you raise the daily fee, you are literally taking from Black neighborhoods that are low income, and subsidizing these white affluent neighborhoods. And that's just built into how they do it. So we need to stop the daily fees. And also, it's not that great. I mean, I know we're planning for the future when we say have electric heat, but right now, electricity in Louisville is generated through fossil fuels. So really, for right now, you're not helping the environment that much by having electric heat, and it is infinitely more expensive. So these programs that encourage electric heat for low-income housing are, not helping anyone in the short term.
Byron?
Sorry, in a rare instance where I disagree a little bit with Kathy, I think modern electric heating, especially heat pumps, is actually much more efficient and cheaper on a basis that electric baseboard heating, you're absolutely right. Like the old style of heating and space heaters, absolutely inefficient and should not be contributed to. But if we can focus programs towards modern, efficient electric heating, it is more efficient. And you're right that our system is what, like 95% fossil fuel fired. But if it is more efficient heating, then it uses less of those fossil fuels too. So there are exceptions anyway where we can promote electrification of heating.
And you know much more than I, so I will bow to that. And I hope you look
I
at
doubt that.
the low-income housing tax credit. They're doing a little change on energy efficiency. So if I can send that to you.
I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
At the state level or the federal
Yes,
legislature?
no, at the state letter,
Okay.
the QAP for qualified
Assistance program.
plan. Yeah, for the low-income housing tax credits. So
Yeah, thank you.
An additional question that I had for Rebecca, what is one policy that if you could implement it right now, it would have the biggest impact on disconnections in the state?
That's a really good question. I think that it would have to be trying to make energy more affordable. I think that disconnection protections are really important to help keep people safe, but ultimately are not going to get at the root cause of why people can't pay their energy bills. So I think there's two things. I think one, we should immediately establish a state customer assistance fund, not because that solves the problem, but because it will help bridge the gap between the state and the utilities figuring out and finding more affordable rates. So I'd say let's do that. Let's help people with their energy bills right now. And then I think simultaneously, let's figure out how the state can and the PSC can require equitable rate design. I think, there are a lot of places that are pursuing those strategies. And, I don't know, utilities are allowed to recover the cost of what it costs them to provide service. And so as those costs increase, we really have to figure out how to make sure that we are keeping energy affordable for those least able to pay. But at the same time, I think I'd be really interested to hear what other people have to say, because you can come at this from so many different angles, right? There's also this whole issue about, the cost of fuel charges on people's bill. The legislature just passed this bill around winter fern, trying to make it so that utilities would spread the fuel adjustment costs of billing across more months, so that in addition to having higher energy usage during those really cold times, there is also this extra added fuel adjustment cost from gas and coal primarily. And so there's also, of course, a great argument to be made for making sure that where utilities are drawing upon the most cost-effective energy resources. And I think, unfortunately, in this state, that has not been the mentality that the legislature has used to approach energy. They want to keep fossil fuels alive, and that is just not the least cost option in many circumstances. So yeah, I'd be really curious what other people have to say though on that for that question.
I think there's so many things that we could implement. The Metropolitan Housing Coalition came out with a report on utility affordability and how it relates to housing affordability. And one of the things that we agree with is creating that critical repair fund, or providing more weatherization services, because I know, especially for not only rural communities, but for larger cities like Louisville, weatherization is a huge problem. More than 70% of the homes here were built pre-1960.
Yeah, definitely. If you can make everything more energy efficient, you use less energy, and then they, for both at the household level, but also at the utility scale level, then these utilities are not having to necessarily go out and purchase more power or invest in new coal or gas plants, or keep struggling aged out coal plants alive, which is all very, very expensive and gets passed on to customers. So there's both the household level benefit of efficiency, as well as the sort of aggregate collective, utility wide territory. I mean, that's something that we talk a lot about in Kentucky Power context, in particular, because they have lost a lot of demand with the shifting away from the coal industry and with population moving out. And there's this tension between them feeling like they need more capacity to build out the economy and thus kind of resolve some of their solutions, versus a lot of us who think, well, let's just make everything as efficient as possible, and then you'll probably actually have extra capacity and you don't need to go and build these things. But anyway, Byron can probably articulate that a lot better than I can, but that's my quick hot take.
No, that was great.
Great. Okay, we have another question from Faith. Do you foresee the emergence of data centers as a threat to energy burdens increasing, especially in rural areas?
I admittedly am trying to build a wall between myself and getting involved in data center policy, just because I feel like I can't bite it off at the moment. But there are a lot of people working on it. There's someone at my organization who's thinking a lot more about it, Mary, and I know Byron and others on this call are. I think I would just generally say that, yes, we are definitely concerned about that. And I think also concerned about making investments for this kind of data center bubble that then fails to materialize, and yet then we still have some investments that were made in kind of hopes of these data centers coming that then ultimately get paid by customers. So yeah, there are others who are much more well informed on the contribution of data centers to this problem, but so I'll stop there and see if others want to chime in.
Yeah, and Faith, I can connect with you after the call as well. MHC is wanting to put out a white paper in the near future about affordability or about data centers in the context of affordability. Alicia also put a report in the chat about data centers as well. So I think we've also done some prior webinars on the consequences of data centers as well, so I can send those out after the call. Any additional questions? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you're not familiar, there's also an organization called Reimagine Appalachia that has been collecting different information and putting together blogs and stuff on data centers. I'll see if I can quickly find that and put it in the chat as well, but you can also Google them.
It looks like Byron beat you to it.
It's on my reading list.
Yeah. Any additional questions for Rebecca? Okay. I will end us with one more question. What can individual consumers or community members do to get involved in supporting disconnection policy?
Yeah, good question. I would say try to connect with Kentuckians for Energy Democracy, a group that is really leading, a collective group that's leading the charge around disconnections protection legislation. And different groups involved in that are like Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, Kentucky and Kentucky Conservation Committee, Mountain Association. We're a part of the collective as well. And I think there are a few others, but I think they're really the brains and collection of folks, and also you all too, Sarah. Yes, who are leading that push. And but I also think it's as simple as just calling your own legislators and asking them to support the bill. There's a legislative hotline that you can call and leave a message for your representatives and senators, and that always certainly helps within the state. So Sarah, I'd also put it back to you and see what you think about that. What do you think the best ways would be to get involved?
Yeah, I would definitely say the Leave the Heat On Collective is always looking for partners to get involved and spread the data about disconnections. I know we have been really trying to put out the data that ACLC recently came out with your all's disconnection report. As far as, you know, what we need for community support is personal stories. We have a lot of the data, but sometimes when it comes to people policymakers, they are looking for qualitative stories. So they're looking for people who have experienced disconnection, whether that's, you know, being $10 past due and being disconnected during a winter storm. K4AD also set up a website to put in personal stories, and it can also remain anonymous. We know a lot of people, like, it could have feelings of embarrassment talking about being disconnected, or especially if you have a small child in the home, there could be concerns about CPS getting involved. So we do have a way for people to tell their stories, but tell it anonymously. And we can use those stories to talk to policymakers, to talk to the Public Service Commission, different people who are working on these problems. Yes, thank you for putting the link in the chat. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I just wanted to say again, thank you so much, Rebecca, for presenting about ACLC's report today. And we're super excited to see where that data goes. I know that there's a couple of stories that have come out through Kentucky Lantern, and I think the Courier Journal is working on it as well. So we'll be excited to see that in the press.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me and for everyone's good questions. It was great.
Yes,
Appreciate it.
absolutely. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that the Metropolitan Housing Coalition is hosting a housing and utility affordability conference. That is April 7th at the Muhammad Ali Center. And we will be talking about all kinds of different content, such as disconnection protections, renewable energy, water affordability, all in the context of affordable housing. So if you are interested in that, we will be highlighting ACLC's report during that panel towards the end of the day. I will put the link in the chat to check out tickets. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.